My name is Helen Park. I am 46 years old. I want to start with the phone call that ended 8 years of a very specific kind of silence. It came on a Thursday afternoon in April, 3 years ago, at 2:17 in the afternoon, while I was in my office at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, reviewing a grant proposal that was due at the end of the week. My office was the particular kind of academic office that accumulates slowly over years into a specific physical record of the work done inside it. Books on shelves organized by the private logic of use rather than any formal cataloging system. Printouts of papers in progress stacked in folders that were color-coded in a system I had developed and could interpret, and that would have been opaque to anyone else. A corkboard covered in index cards connected by strings that represented the specific relational map of a research project that had been in progress for 4 years and whose connections I needed to see physically to understand completely. The phone call was from a woman named Dr. Margaret Sullivan, who was the chair of the American Public Health Association's Distinguished Research Award Committee. The award was given annually to a researcher whose body of work had made a significant and sustained contribution to the field of public health research methodology. It was one of the most significant honors available in my specific professional domain. Dr. Sullivan said, "Dr. Park, thank you for taking my call. I'm reaching out as chair of the APHA Distinguished Research Award Committee. We've received a nomination for the award this year, and your name has come up in our verification process. I'm hoping you can help us with a few questions." I said, "Of course. What can I help you with?" She said, "The nomination we've received is for Dr. Christine Park. Christine Park is my sister. She is 43 years old. She has a doctorate in public health and has spent her career at a research institution in Boston." I said, "I see." Dr. Sullivan said, "In the supporting materials for the nomination, Dr. Christine Park lists herself as the lead researcher on a body of work in public health research methodology spanning from 2009 to 2017. The work is described as developing a specific framework for multi-level analysis in population health studies, and the nomination cites 11 publications from that period attributed to this work." She paused. She said, "When our committee conducted its standard verification review of the publications listed in the nomination, we encountered a specific discrepancy that I want to ask you about directly." I said, "Yes." She said, 7 of the 11 publications listed in Dr. Christine Park's nomination have Helen Park listed as the corresponding author, with Christine Park listed as a co-author. 3 of the 11 are sole authored by Helen Park with no co-author. 1 is co-authored with a different collaborator entirely. None of the 11 list Christine Park as the lead or corresponding author. She said, "I want to be direct with you, Dr. Park. This is a significant discrepancy between what the nomination represents and what the publication record shows. Before we take any further action, I wanted to speak with you to understand the factual history of this work." I looked at the corkboard on my wall, with its index cards and strings, and the particular map of 8 years of research that I could read the way some people read landscapes, by knowing what each element was and how it connected to every other element. I said, "Dr. Sullivan, I want to be equally direct with you. The work you are describing is my work. I developed the multi-level analysis framework beginning in 2009. The publications are mine. Christine contributed to some of them as a co-author in specific ways that were meaningful and that I have always acknowledged appropriately, which is why she appears as a co-author rather than a sole author on the collaborative papers. The representation that she was the lead researcher on this body of work is not accurate." There was a brief silence. Dr. Sullivan said, "I was hoping you would say that, or rather, I was hoping the answer would be clear in one direction or the other, and it is." She said, "Dr. Park, I want to ask you one more thing. Do you have documentation of the development of this work across the period in question? Research notes, grant applications in your name, correspondence related to the work, that kind of documentation? I said, yes. She said, can you make that documentation available to the committee if we request it? I said, yes. I have maintained comprehensive documentation across the full period of the work. It is organized and accessible. She said, thank you, Dr. Park. The committee will be in touch. She hung up. I sat in my office for a long time after that phone call, looking at the corkboard and the index cards and the strings, and I thought about 8 years of a very specific kind of silence, and about the particular decision I had made 9 years ago about how to keep records of my own work and why, and about what that decision had produced. Before I tell you what the committee found, and what happened to Christine's nomination, and what happened to Christine and to me in the months after the phone call, let me take you to the beginning. Because the beginning is where I first understood what kind of relationship I had with my sister, and where I made the specific choice about how to document my work that determined what was available to Dr. Sullivan when she called on a Thursday afternoon in April. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the older of 2 daughters born to James and Mary Park, who had come to the United States from South Korea in 1974, when my father was accepted into the University of Michigan's doctoral program in statistics. He spent his career as a professor of statistics at Michigan, the particular academic life of someone who had found the exact right professional home and who had never seriously considered leaving it. My mother had been a secondary school mathematics teacher in Korea and retrained after their arrival in the United States, ultimately teaching high school mathematics in the Ann Arbor public schools for 27 years. 2 mathematically inclined parents, 2 daughters. The dynamic was the particular dynamic of Korean-American academic families of their generation in a university town, organized around the specific expectations that such families carry about educational achievement and professional seriousness, and the particular form of discipline required to build something that lasts. My sister Christine arrived 3 years after me in 1977, and from the earliest period of our childhood, she had the particular quality of someone who understood how to present herself within the specific expectations of our household and our community in ways that produced maximum recognition for the effort involved. I want to be precise about this because I think precision serves the story better than either condemnation or excuse. Christine was not dishonest in the simple way. She was a person who had developed, beginning in childhood, a specific skill for managing the presentation of her work and her accomplishments in ways that emphasized her role in any outcome while minimizing or omitting the contributions of others. This is a specific personality quality that exists on a spectrum, and Christine's expression of it was toward the more significant end of that spectrum. But it did not begin with the research that Dr. Sullivan called me about. It began in childhood, in the small economies of how credit was allocated within a family with high achievement expectations and 2 daughters who were both achieving. I noticed it from early. Not with the conceptual framework I have described it with here, which is an adult framework applied to childhood observations, but with the particular attentiveness of an older sibling who was watching a younger sibling navigate the same expectations she was navigating, and who understood, with the specific operational intelligence of a child, that Christine was navigating them differently. She was better at claiming credit. Specifically, she was better at being present in the moments when credit was available to be claimed, and at being absent in the moments when credit was less available, and the work was primarily occurring without anyone watching. She did homework, but she was more consistently present for the showing of completed homework to our parents than she was for the doing of it. She contributed to family projects, but she was more consistently present for the presentation of the project to relatives than for the execution of it in the days before the presentation. I want to say again that this is a spectrum and that what Christine was doing was not dramatic in any single instance. It was the particular accumulated pattern of someone managing how they were perceived in an environment where perception mattered. And the managing was skillful enough that I do not think my parents ever saw it clearly, though I think my mother had a version of seeing it that she expressed through the specific form of extra directness she brought to praising my work that suggested she was aware of a dynamic she was trying to counterbalance. I went to the University of Michigan for my undergraduate degree in biostatistics, the particular choice of someone who had grown up watching her father think about statistics and who had inherited both the aptitude for it and the genuine interest in the questions it was designed to answer. Christine went to Boston University for public health, the choice of someone who had identified a field adjacent to mine, but distinct enough to be hers, and who was, in the Boston University program, genuinely talented in her own right and building her own specific competence. We pursued parallel academic careers in overlapping but distinct areas. I ended up at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, studying population health research methodology, the specific domain of how we think about and implement the statistical methods for understanding how health outcomes are distributed across populations and what determines that distribution. Christine ended up at a research institute in Boston studying health disparities, the particular domain of understanding why certain populations have worse health outcomes than others, which is a genuine and important field that is also adjacent to my methodological work in the specific way that the question requires the tools. The research collaboration that Dr. Sullivan called me about began in 2009, in the period when Christine's institute was undertaking a large-scale study of cardiovascular health disparities in 3 northeastern cities, and when the analytical challenge the study faced was specifically in my domain of expertise. Christine called me in the fall of 2009 and described the analytical problem. The study was generating data across multiple levels simultaneously, individual health behaviors and clinical outcomes, and neighborhood characteristics, and city-level policy environments, and the standard analytical frameworks available in the health disparities literature at the time were not well suited to capturing the relationships between these levels in ways that would produce interpretable and generalizable findings. I had been thinking about exactly this class of problem for 3 years at that point, having identified it as one of the central methodological challenges facing population health research, and having begun developing the specific analytical framework that would eventually become the basis for my most significant published work. I said yes to the collaboration, not because I thought Christine was the right scientific collaborator for the methodological work I was developing, which was mine and was in a domain where her expertise was limited. I said yes because the cardiovascular disparities study she was running was the right empirical context for developing and testing the methodological framework, and because collaborating with her meant access to the data the study was generating. This is the honest account of why I said yes, and I think the honest account is necessary to understanding what the subsequent 8 years actually looked like. I want to tell you about the 8 years specifically, because the specific texture of the 8 years is the context within which Christine's nomination needs to be understood. The methodological framework was mine. I want to say this plainly and then explain what I mean by it, because claiming credit in a collaborative research environment is a specific and sometimes genuinely complex question, and I want to be clear about what I am claiming and what I am not. The core intellectual contribution of the research, which was the development of a multi-level analysis framework, specifically adapted to population health data, with the particular characteristics of cross-level interaction and hierarchical clustering that population health studies produce, was developed by me. The conceptual architecture of the framework, the specific analytical decisions about how to model the relationships between levels, the theoretical justification for the modeling choices, and the interpretation of the framework's implications for population health research practice were mine. Christine contributed specific things. She contributed domain expertise in health disparities that was useful in determining which empirical applications were most scientifically important, and in interpreting the substantive public health implications of findings produced by the framework. She contributed access to the data from her institute's studies. She contributed effort in some of the implementation work in the early period of the collaboration and in the preparation of some of the papers we produced together. These contributions were real, and I acknowledge them honestly by listing her as a co-author on the papers where they were significant. 3 of the 11 publications Dr. Sullivan mentioned were papers where Christine's contributions were limited enough that I was the sole author, and I listed her as a co-author rather than as the lead on the collaborative papers because her contributions, while genuine, were not the primary intellectual contribution to the work. What Christine did not contribute was the development of the framework. She was not present for the 3 years of thinking before 2009 that produced the specific questions the framework was designed to answer. She was not present for the specific intellectual work of developing the modeling architecture, which happened in my office in Ann Arbor and is documented in my research journals beginning in 2007. She was not the person who made the specific series of analytical decisions that constitute the framework's core contribution. What she was the person who, beginning approximately 4 years into the collaboration, when the framework had been established through several published papers and was beginning to attract attention in the research methodology community, began describing the work in ways that positioned her as the primary contributor. I noticed this at a conference in 2013. I had presented a paper on an extension of the framework at the Society for Epidemiologic Research annual meeting, and in the discussion afterward, someone mentioned that they had heard Christine give a talk at a different conference earlier that year, in which she had described the work as something she and a collaborator had developed, rather than as something she had been involved in implementing. I filed this away. A year later, I was at a workshop in Washington, D.C., and someone I did not know came up to me and said they had seen Christine's presentation at a recent meeting and were interested in learning more about the framework, and could I tell her more about Christine's role in developing it. I said, "The framework was developed in my research program at Michigan. Christine has been a collaborator on some of the empirical applications." The person looked at me in a specific way that suggested this was different from the account they had received. I filed this away also. By 2015, I had accumulated enough specific instances of Christine describing the work in ways that misrepresented her role that I understood the pattern, and I made a specific decision about how to respond to it. The decision was to document everything, not to confront Christine, not to contact the conferences or the institutions where she had misrepresented her role, not to say anything publicly that would create a conflict whose resolution would require me to spend energy I wanted to spend on the research itself. The decision was to maintain a specific, comprehensive documentation of my ownership of the intellectual contribution, the kind of documentation that would allow anyone who investigated the question to arrive at an accurate answer without any intervention from me. I want to describe what this documentation looked like, because the description is the specific evidence of what was available to Dr. Sullivan when she called. The documentation I maintained across the period from 2009 to 2017 included the following specific elements: my research journals, which I had kept since graduate school and which contained dated entries documenting the development of ideas and the specific intellectual decisions made at each stage of the work. The journals from 2007 through 2009, predating the collaboration with Christine, contained the specific earliest development of the multi-level analysis framework, including the particular questions I was trying to answer, and the first attempts at the modeling architecture that eventually became the framework's core. These journals are dated and continuous, and they document the development of the intellectual work in my handwriting over a period of time. My grant applications. I had received funding from the National Institutes of Health for the methodological research beginning in 2010, and the grant applications, which were submitted in my name as principal investigator, described the research program that was producing the framework and the publications. The NIH review records showed that the grants were reviewed and funded based on the quality of the research program I had described, which was mine. My correspondence records. I had maintained complete email archives related to the research, including correspondence with Christine about the collaboration, with the journals about the publications, with conference organizers about presentations, and with other researchers in the field about the work. The correspondence documented consistently who was doing what and how the collaboration was structured. The publication records themselves. 7 of the 11 papers had me as the corresponding author, which is the specific designation in academic publishing that indicates primary responsibility for the work and the primary point of contact for the publication. 3 were sole authored by me. The attribution in the papers was accurate, and the accuracy of the attribution was itself a form of documentation, and my specific records of Christine's misrepresentations across the 2013 to 2017 period, which I had begun keeping systematically once I understood the pattern. These records included dates, venues, and specific descriptions of instances where Christine had characterized the work in ways that misrepresented her role. I maintained this documentation not because I anticipated Dr. Sullivan's phone call specifically, but because I had made the decision to keep the record accurate and accessible regardless of what use it was ever put to. My father had said to me once, reviewing my research journals when I showed them to him during a visit, that the most important thing a researcher could do was maintain the record of their own thinking. Not for credit. To understand where ideas came from and how they developed and what paths were not taken and why. He said the record was the research, as much as the published papers, because the papers showed only the conclusions and the record showed the whole story. I thought about that when Dr. Sullivan called. Let me stop here for a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever made a specific decision about how to keep records of your own work? Not because you anticipated needing those records for any particular purpose, but because you understood that the accurate record was itself a form of integrity that the work deserved, and have you discovered later that the decision was more consequential than you knew when you made it? Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what happened in the 4 weeks after Dr. Sullivan's phone call is the specific part of this story that I want you to understand before it ends. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. The APHA Distinguished Research Award Committee completed its review in 4 weeks. Dr. Sullivan called me on a Monday afternoon 3 weeks after our initial conversation to let me know that the committee had requested the documentation I had mentioned, and that I should expect a formal request from the committee's legal counsel. The formal request came the following day. I provided the documentation over the course of 2 days, organizing it into the specific categories that the request specified, and writing a cover letter that described the organization of the materials and the period covered by each category. 4 days after I submitted the documentation, Dr. Sullivan called again. She said, "Dr. Park, the committee has completed its review of the materials you provided. I want to tell you what we found and what we are going to do about it." I said, "Yes." She said, "The documentation you provided is comprehensive and it is consistent in establishing the specific history of the research. The publication record, the grant applications, the research journals, and the correspondence collectively establish clearly that the multi-level analysis framework was developed in your research program at Michigan and that your role in the research has been as the primary intellectual contributor throughout." She said, "The committee has also found that Christine Park's nomination contained specific misrepresentations about her role in the research. The nomination stated that she was the lead researcher on the work described and attributed the primary intellectual contribution to her. The documentation establishes that this description is not accurate." She said, "The committee has decided to withdraw Christine's nomination for the Distinguished Research Award. We are also going to contact Christine and the institution where she is employed to share our findings." I said, "I understand." She said, "Dr. Park, I want to ask you something before we conclude this conversation." I said, Yes, she said. You have clearly been aware of some version of this situation for a period of time. You mentioned when we first spoke that you had documentation going back across the full period of the work. Were you aware that Christine was representing herself as the primary contributor to this research? I said, yes. From approximately 2013, I was aware of a pattern of misrepresentation in how she described the work in conference presentations and professional conversations. She said, and you maintain documentation of this? I said, yes. She said, but you did not raise the issue formally. I said, no. She said, can I ask why not? I sat with the question. I said, because the research was more important to me than the credit, and addressing the misrepresentation formally would have required me to spend energy on the dispute rather than on the work. I made a decision to keep an accurate record and let the record speak when it needed to speak. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the record spoke. I said yes. She said, you should know that in 22 years of committee work, I have never encountered documentation of a research contribution that was as comprehensive and well-organized as what you provided. Most researchers do not maintain records of this quality. I said, my father was a statistician. He taught me that the record was the research. She said, he was right. She said, Dr. Park, the committee would like to know whether you would be willing to be considered for the Distinguished Research Award yourself. Based on what we have reviewed, your body of work is exactly what the award is designed to recognize. I said, yes, I would be willing to be considered. She said, we will be in touch. She was in touch 3 months later with the committee's decision, but before I tell you that, I want to tell you about the conversation with Christine. Christine called me on the Wednesday after Dr. Sullivan's first call, which was the day after Christine received the committee's notification that her nomination was being reviewed due to discrepancies in the supporting materials. Her voice when I answered had the particular quality of someone who has received unexpected information and who is in the process of determining how to respond to it before they have completed the determining. She said, the APHA committee called me. I said, I know. They called me first. She said, you spoke with them. I said, yes. They asked me to verify the publication records. She said, what did you tell them? I said, I told them the truth about the history of the research, that the methodological framework was developed in my research program, that I was the lead researcher on the work, and that your contributions were as a collaborator on specific aspects of the empirical applications. She said, Helen. I said, Christine. She said, you know that collaboration means shared credit. I said, yes, and I gave you shared credit. Your name is on the collaborative papers exactly as your contribution warranted. That is what shared credit means. She said, I was listed as a co-author, not as the lead. I said, because you were not the lead. The work was mine. You know that. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I contributed to that work. I said, yes, you did. Specifically and genuinely. And I acknowledged every specific genuine contribution you made. What I did not do was attribute to you the intellectual ownership of work that was mine. She said, we built it together. I said, Christine, I built it. You collaborated on applications of it. Those are different things, and you know they are different things. She said, you're going to let them withdraw my nomination. I said, the committee makes its own decisions. I answered their questions honestly. She said, after everything. I said, what everything? She said, we're sisters. Family comes first. I looked at the corkboard on my wall, at the index cards and the strings. I said, family comes first. I believe that. And that is why I did not confront you in 2013 when I first understood what you were doing. That is why I did not contact the conferences or the institutions. That is why I maintained my documentation quietly for 4 years, and did not say anything to anyone about it. Because family comes first, and I chose to let the record speak rather than to create a public conflict that would have cost both of us something. I said, but family coming first does not mean I am obligated to confirm a misrepresentation of my own work when a committee asks me directly whether the misrepresentation is accurate. She said nothing for a long time. She said, the committee is going to contact my institution. I said, yes. Dr. Sullivan told me they would. She said, this is going to affect my career. I said, the choices you made over 8 years have affected your career. I answered questions honestly when I was asked. She said, you kept records. I said, yes. She said, for how long? I said, since 2009, continuously. The journals go back to 2007. She said, you knew this might happen. I said, I knew the record should be accurate and accessible. I did not know what use it would be put to or when. I kept it because the work deserved an accurate record, regardless of whether anyone ever asked about it. She said, Dad's journals. I said, yes. She said, you kept them the way he kept his. I said, yes. She was quiet for a very long time after that. She said, Helen, I want to ask you something. I said, yes. She said, did you know this was going to happen? Did you know the committee was going to call? I said, no. I did not know anyone had nominated you, and I did not know the committee was going to call. She said, but you were ready? I said, I was always ready, because the record was always there. She said, I don't know what to say to you. I said, I know. She said, are we going to be all right? I sat with the question, the corkboard and its connections visible over my laptop screen, the particular map of 8 years of research that I had built and maintained and documented, and that had, on a Thursday afternoon in April, been seen clearly by the first person who had looked at it with professional authority to look. I said, I don't know yet. What happens now is going to determine that. How you respond to what the committee found and how you respond to your institution and what you do next. I can't tell you the answer to that question in advance. She said, I understand. I said, Christine. She said, yes. I said, the work you actually did on those papers was good work. The empirical expertise you brought to the health disparities applications was real and it mattered to the papers. That is true, and it does not stop being true because of what you also did. She was very quiet. She said, thank you for saying that. I said, it was true. I'm saying it because it's true. The APHA Distinguished Research Award was presented to me at the annual meeting the following November, the same year Dr. Sullivan first called. The award was for the body of work in public health research methodology spanning the period from 2009 to the present, described in the committee's citation as having developed a framework for multi-level analysis in population health research that had significantly advanced the field's capacity to understand and address the complex multi-level determinants of population health. My father came to the ceremony. He was 78 years old and had been retired from the Michigan statistics faculty for 4 years, and he sat in the audience in the specific composed way of a man who is receiving something he has been expecting for some time without knowing when it would arrive. When I came off the stage with the award, he said, "Show me." I handed him the plaque. He read it carefully, the way he read everything. He said, "The citation is accurate." I said, "I know." He said, "It could have been given for the journals alone." I said, "I know." He said, "Did you tell Dr. Sullivan about the journals?" I said, "Yes. She asked for the documentation, and I provided the journals as part of it." He said, "She saw them." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then she knew. Before she finished reviewing the materials, she already knew." I said, "Yes, I think so." He said, "Because the journals showed the thinking, not just the conclusions." I said, "Yes." He said, "The record is the research." I said, "Yes, Dad." "The record is the research." He held the plaque for a moment longer and then gave it back to me. He said, "You should call your mother." I said, "I already did." He said, "Good." Christine was not at the ceremony. She was not a member of the APHA, and the ceremony was not the kind that people attended unless they had a specific reason, and she did not have a specific reason. What happened with her institution's review of the committee's findings is private to Christine and her institution, and I am not going to describe it in detail here because it belongs to her and to them, rather than to this story. What I will tell you is that she called me in the spring of the year after the award, after the institutional process had concluded, and that the conversation we had was the specific kind of conversation that can only happen after something significant and difficult has been fully processed by both parties. She said, "I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you think about confronting me directly at any point? Between 2013 and when the committee called?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because confronting you would have made it about us, and the work was not about us. The work was about the research. And because I knew that a confrontation would produce exactly what did happen, which was a conflict that would cost both of us something significant. I wanted to avoid that cost if it was possible to avoid it." She said, "And you decided the documentation was how to avoid it." I said, "I decided the documentation was the honest thing to maintain, regardless of what happened. The question of whether to confront you was a separate question from the question of whether the record should be accurate. The record should always be accurate. That was not contingent on anything." She said, "And the confrontation?" I said, "The confrontation I was hoping to avoid indefinitely. I was hoping that the pattern would stop. It didn't stop, and eventually someone asked the question that required me to answer honestly. She said, 'You answered it.' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'Helen, I want to say something and I need you to let me say it without interrupting.' I said, 'Go ahead.' She said, 'I told myself for 8 years that the collaborative work was ours, in a way that made the description I was using accurate enough. I told myself that collaboration meant shared ownership in a way that made it legitimate to describe myself as the lead. I knew, on some level, that I was not willing to access that this was not true. The evidence was in how carefully I avoided any conversation with you about how you or I described the work publicly. If the description had been accurate, I would not have had to avoid those conversations. I was avoiding them because I knew you would have said something and I did not want you to say it." She said, "I built a specific story about the work that put me at the center of it, and I sustained that story across 8 years by being careful about what conversations I had and with whom. And the story was not true. I knew it was not true while I was sustaining it." She said, "That is the honest account." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry. Specifically. Not for what happened to my career, which is a consequence of my own choices. For what I did to your work for 8 years. For taking something that was yours and using it to build something that was mine." I said, "Thank you for saying it specifically." She said, "It's the least the situation requires." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are we all right?" I said, "We're in the specific process of finding out." She said, "That's fair." I said, "Christine, the work you actually did on those papers." She said, "You said that before." I said, "I'm saying it again because it's still true. The empirical contributions were real. You were a good collaborator on the parts of the work where you were collaborating honestly. That's the record too, and I want you to know I know it." She said, "Thank you." She said, "What are you working on now?" I said, "An extension of the multi-level framework to handle longitudinal population health data. 3 years in." She said, "Is it good?" I said, "Yes, I think so." She said, "Are you keeping the journals?" I said, "I've kept the journals every day since graduate school. I'm not going to stop now." She said, "No, I don't suppose you would. Here is what 8 years of a specific kind of silence and one phone call on a Thursday afternoon in April, and a corkboard of index cards in a university office in Ann Arbor taught me. I know that the record of your thinking is as important as the conclusions your thinking produces, that the journals and the correspondence and the grant applications and the specific documentation of the intellectual development of your work are not administrative byproducts of research, but are themselves a form of the research, the particular ongoing evidence of where the ideas came from and how they developed and what decisions were made, and why. My father taught me this when I was in graduate school, and I have practiced it every day since, and the practice was exactly what Dr. Sullivan needed when she called. I know that the decision to let the record speak, rather than to speak yourself, is sometimes the right decision. Not always, not as a general principle, but in the specific situation where the record is comprehensive, and the speaking would cost more than waiting, and where the waiting does not require you to make any false statements or to allow any harm that the waiting allows you to prevent. I waited because Christine was my sister, and because the research was more important than the credit, and because I believed that if the question was ever directly asked, the record would answer it accurately without requiring me to make it personal. I know that the record speaks when someone who has the authority and the motivation to read it reads it, and that Dr. Sullivan read it because Christine's nomination contained a misrepresentation significant enough to produce a verification call, which produced the specific conversation in which I told the truth about the history of the work, which produced the request for documentation, which produced the specific recognition that the committee's process was designed to produce when the research being nominated was genuinely significant. And I know that Christine's apology, the specific honest apology of someone who has described accurately what they did and why they knew it was wrong, was worth more to me than the award. Not because the award did not matter, but because the apology was the specific evidence of something I had wanted to believe across 8 years, which was that my sister was capable of the particular honesty that the situation required when the situation made any other response impossible. She was, eventually. The research continues. The corkboard has new index cards and new strings. The journals continue, dated and continuous. The record is the research and the research is the record, and both are being maintained in the particular daily discipline of someone who learned from her father that the honest account of the thinking matters as much as the published conclusions. That is my story. 8 years of documentation maintained in the specific daily discipline of keeping an accurate record. One phone call that asked a direct question, an honest answer to the direct question, and the particular clarity of a record that had been waiting for exactly the right reader. If this reminded you of work you documented carefully across years without knowing exactly what the documentation was for, only that the accurate record was what the work deserved, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who is doing important work and who needs to know that the record of the thinking is as important as the published conclusions, and that the daily discipline of keeping the record accurately is itself a form of integrity that the work demands. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.